Hello, everyone. My name is Mohamed Menza, and I'm the Senior Director of Executive Education at the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the American University in Cairo. And I also happen to be a professor at the university, whereby I teach courses in cross-cultural communication and dialogue between universities in our part of the world, the MENA region, and several other parts, including the Arab region and inter-Arab dialogue, Western countries, as in North America and Western Europe, and of course the global South. And I believe this is the gist or the focus of our discussion and topic today. Now, I think it's an opportune moment since this event is discussing um, or dubbed or named after Bandung and the very first sort of attempts to build a global South alliance through the non-aligned movement now almost 70 years ago. I think it's also an opportune moment to perhaps look into the origins, the history of this term, the global South, how it came about, and the connotations or the connections that today we have, or the countries of the global South do have, with the experiences of transformation that have been taking place in the now called global South, the then maybe called the third world or developing world back in the 1950s. And it's also quite opportune, I believe, because the course that I teach or that I've been teaching at AUC was still actually is called cross-cultural communication and connections within the global South, South-South dialogue. So the idea, maybe I'll start with this and then go back and reflect on the notion of Bandung or the notion of NAM back in the 1950s and the relevance of this today. So when we started the course, it was an attempt, our most recent or latest attempt to build a cross-cultural communication and dialogue course. So AUC has had now for more than 22 years, for the good part of 20, since 2003, we have had an East-West dialogue course whereby we combine students from the global South, the Arab region, with counterparts from the US and Western Europe. And back then, I believe until today still, the tendency seems to be if we're doing some sort of a cross-cultural communication, then it should be us and them, us as in the Arab region, the Muslim region, the MENA region, and them. And most probably them would be somewhere in North America or in Europe or the developed world, the global north. And most of the thinking goes into this, that if countries from the developing world or from the MENA region are doing some kind of cross-cultural dialogue, then it has to take place with the more developed or the more developed regions. And I think there is merit to this idea in many ways, that developing countries need to learn from the experiments of more developed ones. Developing countries need to connect with the technological advancements, the modernization, the development that's taking place in developed countries, definitely. And also vice versa. I mean, countries of the world need to understand more about the intricate detail and the context and the challenges faced by the countries that they develop. So there's a mutual benefit here in this process. There's definitely a logical reason or a number of logical factors that lead to it happening. That's on the one hand. But at the same time, also, if we look at the number of initiatives that focus on inter-regional dialogue or intra-regional dialogue, whether this is within the Arab world or within the global South at large, you'll find that most of the funding, the resources, the organization, the focus is actually channeled towards this kind of either global South, global North dialogues and, for our connections, you name it, or East-West, this sort of almost insistence or persistence of focusing and nurturing and supporting these boundaries or these bilateral, these bipolar initiatives seems to be the overriding phenomenon. So in our case, in the American University in Cairo, some years in 2011, we thought about, now that the so-called Arab Spring was taking place, now all of these movements of transformation were happening, starting in North Africa, Tunisia, Egypt, and then later in other parts of the Arab region. It started happening. We thought, well, I mean, we for the longest time now, we've had an East-West dialogue course. what about starting a course that focuses on intra-Arab dialogue and have built more bridges built between universities in countries like Morocco and Tunisia and Egypt and Lebanon, and have the youth converse, although the faculty have them converse with each other. Because again, as you said, most of our attempts seem to be directed towards the other, as in the other region or the more developed region. But when it comes to initiatives of intra-dialogue within the Arab or the developed, very limited opportunities. So at the time, it was really a great opportunity for the students to learn from their counterparts in these other Arab countries, because contrary to common sense, I mean, a lot of people in the Arab world, and especially in Egypt, think that they know a lot or more about the others within their own region. But that's not really true. That there's so much to still learn about a seemingly homogeneous and unified culture, such as that one in the MENA region. But there's definitely more than meets the eye. Definitely, it's just way more than the simple sort of set of similarities and commonalities that we may think of. To cut a longer story short, the second step was at the Global South itself. I mean, now that we also look at the initiatives that build sort of bridges or cultural understandings and dialogue between the countries of the Global South and each other, we will find that these opportunities are quite limited. I mean, we don't have that many opportunities, whether for the students or the faculty or the researchers. So in the start of 2012, we initiated our very first South-South dialogue course for the student surveys. And ever since then, I mean, we're talking now 13 years plus, we've been going strong. The demand seems to be quite steady, if not increasing, within the American University in Cairo. But also in other universities, we see that sort of growing interest in building bridges between the Global South countries and each other. And hence your also esteemed institute, the Moroccan Institute for the Global South, which is, again, one other attempt that shows the relevance, the importance, the magnitude, the impact that this kind of inter-dialogue can lead to. Now, back to the issue of Bandung in 1955, as you all, of course, well know, that in 1955, the very first forum in the post-colonial era for collaboration and dialogue in a practical manner between countries of the then called Third World that were not necessarily counted or perceived as part of neither the First World, of course, the victors or the liberal capitalist economies and countries of the victors of World War II, predominantly led by the US, Britain, France, and then later on co-opting the rest of Europe, like West Germany and Western Europe and Italy, other countries, of course, and the Second World, which was predominantly the social communist camp, again led by the other victors in the Second World War, the Soviet Union, China, and then later on also other countries that were co-opted, North Korea, Eastern Europe, and other parts of the world. But then there was the Third World, which was pretty much, I mean, first of all, the terminology itself, the term itself is a somewhat derogative to presume, based on a Eurocentric or a global North-centric perspective, that whatever that's not liberal capitalist nor socialist communist is the third. That in itself, this sort of term carries within it the seeds of bias and also the nature that they know that they're third-ranking countries that have not really met the criteria or the features of the first or the second category. So they're qualified only as third countries. So I mean, the starting point, I would say, is a bit of a misgiving. But now, if you look at the history of that, 1955, exactly 10 years after the end of World War II, you find the first attempt by the countries of the not first or not second, let's call them the developing world, the emerging economies of the time, the post-colonial experience of the time. And they thought, well, why don't we have our own lines, build our own coalition of countries that connects between all of these newly independent states that have just managed to emerge out of different forms of colonialism. Again, the spectrum of degrees, I would say, of foreign domination, from occupation to full colonialism to semi-quasi-colonialist structures, And you had five countries, and then later, of course, more countries joined, but you had countries almost with representation from different parts of the world at the time. So from Asia, you had, of course, the host, Indonesia, one of the biggest countries in Asia and in the world, the country with, to the surprise of some, with the biggest population of Muslims in the world today, more than 280 million people today. And at the time, of course, they were led by the very famous leader of Indonesia, Ahmad Sukarno. And along with Indonesia, you also had from Africa, countries like Ghana. And Ghana, of course, the Gold Coast, again, was another nascent example of a nation that had just emerged out of British colonialism, and they're on the verge of starting their very first um, nation independent modern nation state experience with Nwankwo Nkrumah, the president at the time of Ghana. And then, of course, you had from Asia, India, today the biggest country in the world in terms of population. And at the time, again, another inspiring example for a country that has just also emerged from the scourge of British colonialism, more than 100 years of dominant control, exploitation of resources, and one of the exemplar cases of colonialization in the world, in the history of mankind, really, of India. Again, a very important part of the process. And from North Africa, had Egypt, which at the time, under the presidency of Nasser, was experiencing its own pathway of post-colonial or post-British occupation experience of independence that almost a year later culminated with the nationalization of the Suez Canal, which was also at the same time marked in the West as the Suez Crisis, which was in many ways, and in the words of British historians and diplomats and political scientists, the actual or the practical end of the British Empire, 1956. But that maybe is left for another opportunity of discussion. And of course, not least, you had the most unusual candidate, which is a country from Europe, Yugoslavia, led by Joseph Tito, which again at the time was keen on distancing itself a little bit from the experience of the Soviet Union. Yes, they were predominantly perceived as a socialist country, but they wanted to carve their own path that's independent from the Soviet Union, and so they were interested as a result in joining the NAM as a founding member. Of course, this country does not exist anymore, as you all well know. Now it's disintegrated to the countries of Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Macedonia, Montenegro, and I'm not sure if I missed one. Yeah, anyways, so you know which country or countries we're talking about. So anyways, I mean, this was the attempt at the time to build a coalition of these countries, try and work together as a unified bloc against the bipolar world of the East and the West. And in the 50s and the 1960s, I think it's very important to study the experience or the experiment of the developmental state model that was implemented in a lot of these countries. By the 70s, of course, the model faltered, was dependent mostly on the idea of providing social welfare, the social welfare state that provides for its own citizens, means of social services like education, health, infrastructure development, housing, basic goods and services at subsidized prices. So it was really an experience or an experiment into building some sort of a social mobility that would empower the masses of the population to grow up the social ladder and become more active in their own respective communities. And this was pretty much the name of the game in most developing countries in the 1950s and the 60s. But these countries were, I would say, prototypes because they were among the first that gained their independence from occupation and colonization. And they also managed to build a coalition between them, whereby similar experiences were shared, whereby ideas were also shared. I mean, at the time, we also saw the rise of economic theory, like the dependency model, which was based on the work or the works of theorists coming from the global south, trying to build their own model that was not dependent on the liberal thought necessarily or in the of the predominantly socialist communist ideas that were propagated in the Eastern Bloc at the time. They were trying to build their own model of developmental thought that was based and pretty much influenced by the experiences of the countries of the developing world. Of course, the champions of this independence, who still exist until today, by the way. Maybe some of you are familiar with them. Of course, Samir Amin, the late Samir Amin from Egypt and France. You have folks like Cardoso, for example, who still remains a powerful name in the field of dependency thinking. But I mean, this was a prototype or an exemplar model of attempts that were built in the global South by global South nations, not only to work together on things like intra-trade, on things like exchange of knowledge transfer, and of personnel and expertise, but also on building an indigenous developmental model that was based and ingrained in the experiences and the realities of the countries of the global South. And I think today we are pretty much in need for this to be somewhat reinvigorated. By the 1970s and 80s, the model faltered because of course, because of many reasons, most importantly, the lack of funding and resources. Most of these developmental states that depended mostly on their own resources to try and build a sustainable model of development that is based on the state pumping resources and pumping investment into the social spectrum failed. Because by the 70s, it was quite clear that the ability of these states to keep generating the funds and the resources needed for this kind of investment was not there anymore. And the question had then turned into how to finance development, which still remains to be the question, I believe, in most developing countries today. How can you achieve to finance development without the exceeding dependency on support coming from Western and global North countries that definitely have a lot of things on their agenda, least of which is the actual and proper development of these other countries, as logic may suggest. So anyways, today we still face the same problem and we still face the same questions when it comes to the global South. How can global South countries find sustainable ways and means by which they can finance their developmental model without the exceeding and the ongoing dependency on support and funding coming in from Western and global North countries? Of course, it's might sound like a straightforward question, but the answer is never really straightforward because, again, within the answer lies a lot of details pertinent to the social, economic, political, and cultural conditions and features that these countries today face, and the whole world really faces, including, of course, the massive role played by the international financial institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF. So I think I'll stop here. This is my contribution for today. Again, I want to thank the Moroccan Institute for the Global South for their very kind invitation and this fascinating opportunity to speak with you all. And I hope there will be more opportunities for more global South or South-South dialogue and cooperation in the near future. Thank you very much.